Hi there, it's Jonathan here. This is 60-60. We're reading 260 chapters of the New Testament in 60 days. We're in Acts chapters 16 to 18. The Apostle Paul is on his first missionary journey. The gospel is beginning to go to the whole world. Remember, Jesus said, "Wait in Jerusalem until you are empowered from on high, and then you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the rest of the world." I would encourage you to look up a map of first century Israel and the Mediterranean. It's so much more meaningful if you have an idea of the scope of movement in the mission of the early church. So we start out at the most eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea, in Israel. Paul moves northwest towards modern-day Turkey and meets Timothy in the bottom half of Turkey, around the middle, at a place called Lystra. Now, this is the Timothy who Paul wrote to in the book of Timothy. You'll notice that the epistles we're going to come to typically can be found somewhere in the book of Acts. This is Acts giving us the origin stories of the characters and the relationships. Paul moves northward in Turkey around what was called Galatia. Verse 7 is interesting. Paul is planning on heading further north to the very top of Turkey, known as Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus won't let him. Rather, he is led further west near Gallipoli and across into the top of Greece, which is Macedonia. Fascinating how God's sovereign hand is guiding the expansion of his church. When Paul goes across to Greece, he finds Lydia, who gets saved. Now, Lydia just happens to be a very wealthy and influential woman. Purple cloth is for the elite in society. Who knew God wanted to access some resources from people he'd been preparing to receive his good news? Got to always remember, we are co-workers with the Lord and really need to walk in conversational intimacy with him to stay on his path. Chapter 16 ends with Paul and Silas getting persecuted pretty nastily. Of course, Jesus said, "I must show him how much he must suffer for my name." These are some of the trials Paul recounts in 2 Corinthians 11. 1631 is the classic salvation of the jailmaster, whose whole household gets saved and baptized. This is sometimes used as an argument for infant baptism. Now, us Baptists think it's a little underwhelming. No reason to say that the household weren't all old enough to be baptized as believers by immersion. Verse 40 is a good example of what the early church mission was about, moving around and encouraging the believers in different locations. 17:2 tells us again of the custom of Paul to go to the synagogues. Here he reasoned with them to prove that Jesus was Messiah. Remember, this is what the gospel writers were attempting to do, teach that Jesus is the anointed one, the Christ of God. Verse 4, some Jews were persuaded, but others were jealous and caused a riot. It's a topsy-turvy life being a missionary in the first century. Berea is a place where we are told the people were of noble character because they studied the scriptures intently. Not a bad people group to emulate, to be like the Bereans. Acts 17:16 to 34 is the passage for the apologists. I mean modern-day apologists. Acts 17 shows Paul using gentleness and respect to connect with his audience, acknowledging their spirituality and then sharing truth from a place of dialogue. 1 Peter 3:15 says, "Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect." Personally, I've stood at Mars Hill in the centre of Athens. It's surrounded by the remains of the Stoic and Epicurean philosophers. Paul was taking on some real heavyweights here, but he did so with boldness, in the power of the Spirit, and yet with humility. Chapter 18 reminds us that Paul is bivocational. He's a tent maker, working for his supper as he travelled. From Athens, he heads back to Ephesus in Turkey, then all the way back to Jerusalem, then back to Antioch, on his way back to Turkey in Galatia. The early missionaries were certainly on the move. Enjoy God's word.